Through the telling of the Christmas story this year, we've heard the story of one remarkable young person after another whose strength and courage were an inspiration. We heard of folks like young Mary, who rose above the fear of what could happen to her as a pregnant, unmarried young woman in order to give birth to Jesus. And we heard of other folks like Joseph, who, thanks to a visit from an angel, overcame his self-consciousness about what people might think of him marrying an already pregnant young woman in order to participate in the raising of young Jesus. So today we get to hear the story of another bold young person who stepped forward to play the role that had been assigned him, Jesus. Now, in today's story, Jesus is not much younger than his own mother was at the time she gave birth to him. And it is the only story contained in the four canonical gospel that come from Jesus' youth. So listen carefully as I read that story, and then let's come back together and see what we can learn from this bold, courageous young Jesus in our attempts to live fully into the ongoing spirit of Christmas. Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 52 is read from the Common English Bible. Each year, his parents went to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. Now, when Jesus was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to their custom. After the festival was over, they were returning home. But the boy, Jesus, stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents didn't know it. Now, supposing that he was among their band of travelers, Jesus' parents journeyed on for a full day while looking for him among their family and friends. When they didn't find Jesus, they returned to Jerusalem to look for him. And after 3 days, they found him in the temple. He was sitting among the teachers, listening to them and putting questions to them. Everyone who heard Jesus was amazed by his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were shocked. His mother said, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Listen, your father and I have been worried. We've been looking for you." Jesus replied, "Why were you looking for me? Didn't you know that it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house?" But they didn't understand what Jesus said to them. Jesus went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. His mother cherished every word in her heart, and Jesus matured in wisdom and years and in favor with God and the people. And thus ends our sacred reading this week. So then, friends, what can we learn from this bold young Jesus? Well, for me, the answer comes in verse 49, the verse just after Jesus' mother laid into him and blurted out that they had spent a good deal of time looking for him. That verse where young Jesus said with absolute clarity, "Why were you looking for me? Didn't you know it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house?" You see, in that single verse, Jesus teaches us an important lesson about carrying the spirit of Christmas forward into our daily lives, days, weeks, months, and even years later. For there he teaches us that if we want to do that, if we want to keep that Christmas spirit alive, we need a sense of clarity about who we are and what we have been called to do. Of course, we know what happened when first Mary, then Joseph, and eventually young Jesus had such clarity about their purpose. But those stories make me wonder what might happen when folks like you and I have that kind of clarity as we go out into the world. So this morning, as a sort of belated Christmas gift, I want to give you two examples of what that kind of clarity could look like. The first example comes from the life of a man named Milana Karinga. And the second example from a woman named Claudette Colvin. So let me take a moment and tell you a little about each of them. Milana Karinga was born 80 years ago to a family living in a place called Parsonsburg, Maryland. Later, he moved to Los Angeles, where he eventually attended UCLA and became active in the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 70s. This professor of Africana Studies, this activist, this author in the year 1966, against the backdrop of the Watts riots, which had happened here in Los Angeles, decided to create a brand new holiday called Kwanzaa. Now, that holiday was to be based upon the African harvest traditions, especially those which came from Southeastern and Western Africa. And the name of the holiday itself came from the Swahili phrase, Matunda ya Kwanzaa, which meant first fruits. Now, Karinga changed the spelling of Kwanzaa from 6 to 7 letters by adding an extra A at the end. And he did so for symbolic reasons. For out of that sacred number 7 grew what he called the 7 principles, which I shared with the children of our community in today's children's time. Now, when he was asked about why this new holiday was located so close to Christmas, as Kwanzaa was to run from December 26th through January 1, Karinga, like that young Jesus in the temple from today's story, stepped boldly forward and said this. Kwanzaa was created, he noted, to give Blacks an alternative to the existing holiday of Christmas, and to give Blacks an opportunity to celebrate themselves and their history, rather than simply imitate the practice of the dominant society. Well, over the ensuing decades, Karinga came to see Kwanzaa not so much as an alternative to Christmas, but more as an opportunity for people of faith to bring that spirit of the Christ child into modern times and into modern challenges. So with that in mind, I wondered what it would look like this week to incorporate the spirit of both Christmas with the spirit of Kwanzaa, to live like that young Jesus. And in bringing those experiences together, to have such a clear sense of who you are and from where you've come, that you can help change the world. Well, I'm glad I asked. For you see, the answer to that question takes me to today's second example, that of a young woman by the name of Claudette Colvin. Now, Claudette was not someone whose story I had known before. In fact, I stumbled upon it accidentally during Advent when her story was told on the TV program CBS Mornings. Claudette Colvin was born on the 5th of September in the year 1939 in a place called Montgomery, Alabama. She was a child who was raised in the segregated South. And for much of her youth, Claudette's life was no different than that of her peers. But things changed for Claudette in the morning of March 2nd, 1955. For that afternoon, Claudette and 3 of her friends boarded a bus after school and proceeded to sit in the section marked colored. A young white woman came onto the bus after Claudette and her friends, and she decided that she wanted to sit where those young girls were. Well, Claudette's friends all stood up and did what was expected, moved to another seat silently. Not Claudette. Why? Well, in the spirit of the holiday that would later become Kwanzaa, Claudette explained, I could not move because history had me glued to the seat. It felt as though Harriet Tubman was pushing me down on one shoulder, and Sojourner Truth was pushing me down on the other. Now, sadly, Claudette was immediately arrested and charged with 3 offenses: disturbing the peace, violating the segregation laws, and battering and assaulting a police officer on trumped up charges. Now, she was convicted of just the 3rd offense on the 6th of May in the year 1955. And until just this month, that conviction in juvenile court stayed on her record. Now, all of this had happened to Claudette 9 months before Rosa Parks was arrested for largely the same offenses. And when asked why Rosa Parks' case was chosen to build that civil rights movement upon instead of her own, Colvin noted 2 things. First, she said that Parks' skin was lighter in color than hers. And second, unlike Rosa Parks, who held the title of secretary of the local chapter of the NAACP, Claudette was just a teenager who happened to be pregnant at the time of her arrest as well. And the civil rights leaders of the day felt that their cause would not be well received by the general public if Claudette was the face of the movement. Well, the case made news this past month when Claudette petitioned the courts to finally expunge her record so that the only conviction of her entire life could finally be wiped away. The judge who received the request, Judge Calvin Williams of the Montgomery County Family Court System, appeared that morning in the program with Claudette. And when Claudette saw the judge, she was moved to tears, for she hadn't known previously that he was Black as well. And she noted that it would have been impossible to have a Black judge in Montgomery County when Claudette was young. In explaining at the end of the piece why she decided to fight to have her record expunged after over 6 decades, Claudette showed that same tenacious spirit of the young Jesus in the temple. She noted, and I quote, "When I saw the George Floyd protests, it ignited a spirit in me. I wanted my kids and my grandbabies to see that even at the age of 82 and in a wheelchair, that I still had fight in me." And that, friends, is what happens when our experience of Christmas gets broadened or expanded. When we begin to adapt the images that we have been raised with and the messages of what it was that actually happened in Bethlehem, so that the coming of this Christ child is finally defined not just as good news for some who might look like me or be represented in the dominant culture, but rather as good news for all. Malana Karinga and Claudette Colvin also show us what happens when we claim that unshakable spirit and tenacity of Jesus. When we step forward and boldly proclaim to the world exactly who we are and what it is that we have been called to do. And in those moments, the world is changed forever. And so, friends, as we flip the calendar page this week from 2021 to 2022, my hope and my prayer is that we will find new ways and new circumstances in which to proclaim that Christmas story. New ways to locate and to celebrate ourselves. And new ways to live into the good news. For when we do that, as I've been saying this Advent season, Christmas will be changed. For it will no longer be simply one day on a calendar. No, the spirit of Christmas will take over and live on the other 364 days as well. My prayer is that it will be so. Amen.